Hi, this is my friend Alyssa. I'm going to be performing my speech for her. According to data from the National Center for Education Statistics, poor districts like Philadelphia spend 33% less per student than wealthy districts. This is the biggest such gap in the country. I'm about to enter my senior year studying education. Social justice in education has always been at the forefront of my mind during my studies, and it's something that will always be present in my teaching. The way that public schools in the United States are funded is unjust and should be amended so that there is equitable per-student funding. Today I will outline how the United States currently provides school funding, how the funding is unjust, and what should be done to solve the problem so that per-student funding is equitable. Funding for public schools in the United States comes from a variety of sources. Public school funding comes from a blend of federal, local, and state money. Because nearly half of these funds come from local property taxes, the system generates large funding differences between wealthy and impoverished communities. These discrepancies can and do exist between states, counties, and even between school districts. Additionally, school performance on standardized tests can also affect school funding. According to Dr. Nessa Sasser, who served as a teacher, school counselor, principal, and college professor, a school that consistently fails to meet adequate yearly progress standards may not be able to access some grants and other forms of funding. And after 5 years of failure to meet adequate yearly progress standards, a school can be closed altogether. Lower funding creates lower test scores, which then begets yet more lower funding, effectively creating a vicious cycle that ends in underperformance and school closures. Now that you have a better understanding as to how public schools get funding, I would like to present you with some statistics that show just how inequitable this system is. The public school system in the United States is unjust due to the discrepancies in per-student funding. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania has some of the lowest per-student funding in the country, as well as some of the largest discrepancies between funding in low versus high-income areas. In Philadelphia, for instance, the school district spent $9,062 per student in the 2016 to 2017 school year, whereas the typical wealthy district, like where we live, or where Bucks County Community College is, meanwhile spent $15,748. This is according to the analysis of Mark Price, who's a labor economist at the Keystone Research Center. While this may be only one example, it is representative of the inequitable funding across the state and the country. It's also important not to ignore the racial aspect that comes into place with these discrepancies in school funding. Take the previous example into consideration. In the Philadelphia School District, only 13% of the student population is white, and the rest are minorities. Whereas in a wealthier school district, like the one Bucks County Community College is in, Council Rock, the demographic is 87% white students. These school funding policies disproportionately affect minorities and low-income families, and they need to be amended. I believe that it is important to not only point out the existence of a problem, but to offer a viable solution to make a positive change in the world. There should be equitable per-student funding throughout the United States of America. Instead of solely relying on the discretion of counties or school districts, the property taxes, along with federal, state, and local funding, should be pooled and distributed so that student spending is equitable at least by state, if not throughout the whole country. I also think it's really important to clarify that I'm making a clear distinction here between equality and equity, because some schools will need more funding than others due to specific student needs or the need for the school to catch up. Adopting equitable funding systems will not in itself lead to equal educational opportunities, but equitable school funding is an essential factor in creating a system in which all students have access to a high-quality education and therefore have a chance to achieve academic success. This quote is from Juliana Herman, who is a policy analyst with the Education Policy Team at the Center for American Progress. Although many states have regressive funding policies, There are currently some that are making strides towards equity, and they should serve as an example and a guide to those that aren't. David G. Sciarra, Executive Director of Educational Law Center and a co-author of the National Report Card, illuminates that 17 states, including Virginia, Connecticut, and Texas, have regressive school funding. This means that they provide less funding to their high-need districts than wealthier ones. 20 states, including New York, South Carolina, and Michigan, have flat funding. These states fail to allocate additional funds to address the academic, social, and health needs of students in their poorest schools. These states should strive to be more like California, who has recently invested more, especially in its high-need school districts, and like Massachusetts or New Jersey, who fairly fund their schools. These states provide sufficient funding and significantly higher funding in the poorer districts. They are also the nation's highest performing overall, with students from low-income families making strong gains. Now allow me to briefly summarize the points that I have made during this speech. School funding in the United States comes from federal, state, and local sources, and property taxes have a huge impact on per-student spending. Funding for public schools in the United States is inequitable and disproportionately negatively affects minorities and low-income students. States should change their policies so that per-student funding is equitable, which means giving the money where it is needed. I believe that all students have an equal, inalienable right to a quality education regardless of their zip code, and so should the people that are representing and creating the policies for us. Thank you.